Perfect. So hello everyone. Welcome to the Palácio das Belas Artes Lisboa second online talk. We're very happy to be able to do a second one. But it's the first one we'll be streaming through Twitch. And this is because we have a very special guest and topic today that requires some specific space. We will talk about that as well. So today's talk is redefining performance spaces for virtual worlds, exploring games and beyond. And what better digital space to host that but Twitch? And for those who are not familiar with this platform, and for those watching us through YouTube, which is our regular streaming channel, we do suggest that you try something new today, maybe something new or not, and have this kind of like full experience. And Twitch, for those who don't know, is a streaming platform with a focus on games. So there's a lot of gamers there, but not only that, there's a lot of chatting as well. I usually go for Twitch for just chatting channels. So this is why we thought it might be most appropriate there, most of all. And then YouTube is our regular channel where you can also have a look at the previous hosted online talk with Gaspar Cohen on the PdBA's first exhibition and the artwork we commissioned. And then I invite you to check those out later. The talk is there, it's going to be there for a long time, and so is this one. And that's where we store most of our, videos and online talks and so on. And to follow us there and our other channels, especially on Instagram, where we post a lot of these updates. To introduce myself first, I'm Lia Carrera. I'm a curator and manager of the project, Palácio das Belas Artes Lisboa, which in short we say PdBA, which is an independent artistic and curatorial project mostly based in Lisbon, but that through its online platform hosts exhibitions, public talks and workshops and residencies, not only in the city of Lisbon, but also internationally. And we often invite artists, curators, and a whole set of different creatives and researchers to reimagine other possible relationships between the physical space and the digital space. And we focus on a particular palacio and a palace in Lisbon, but I won't extend myself too much on that and the history of this palacio. But I do invite everyone to check a little bit more about that on our platform and social media. And for this year, we have chosen to discuss the topic of digital spatialities. This talk has a bit of relationship with that, because for us, I think digital spatiality is more of an investigation tool than a well-defined concept, because we are researching and trying to define it a little bit more together with our guests and partners. And we're asking what are the digital spaces of today's museum and art institutions, and what are the tools that bridge the relationship with current art production, artist, and exhibition making. For this year, we have therefore been investigating these things through things like sound composition and soundscaping for space making, digital fabrication and 3D printing for physical spaces that are then brought live as well in other different digital contexts. And we're investigating and researching the relationship with VR, AR, and so on, besides our regular and upcoming online exhibitions through the platform. And this talk and this year's program has been generously supported by the Portuguese Directory of Culture, VRChat, Artes, to whom we thank very much for this opportunity to conduct these free activities, not only the workshops we have been hosting throughout the year, but now we'll set a couple of online talks as well through that funding. That said, I would like to welcome our guest, René Cepeda, who is a multidisciplinary artist, art historian, designer, so many things, originally from Mexico and now based in Germany. And we specialize in new media art. And in Germany now at the KIT, the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, he's developing research on preservation and dissemination of interactive art. and has a particular interest on performance in virtual spaces. That's what he's here to talk about. He's also the curator of the new Media Caucus Heather Photo Gallery, and the co-creator of a couple of publications, very exciting publications on game arts and curating. Maybe we will hear about those as well throughout this conversation, which will be a bit of a conversation. Hi, René.
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, Leah.
Thank you. I thank you for participating in this. And our conversation would be, I think, kind of based on things we have already discussed previously on our talks. We met previously on another, we were talking about this just a minute ago. We met on a online panel as well, hosted by Gabriel Menotti in the Museum Without Walls. And that's how we met, and it was really interesting conversation. I thought, oh, this would be so nice to have you here as well for the PdBA, and to kind of understand a little bit more about performance in virtual world. And that's not my field of specialty. I'm mostly focusing as an artist and curator on digital practice, but in exhibition spaces, but mostly visual arts oriented. So I'm here to learn a lot. And see all of these references that I know you're going to bring in and discuss today in this conversation. For those watching now live and later on, or for those watching now, you can always use the chat. There's chat on YouTube and on Twitch that you can send us any questions that you have throughout this streaming. And then later on as well, there are chats that you can kind of message us. And if you have any questions, we are happy to try to answer them. But do also follow us in other channels and reach out if there's any topic of interest or anything that sparked your interest on this topic. But I will start with a bit of like introductional questions, so we can also situate people that are from the arts or are not necessarily from the arts, but are not engaged necessarily with performance or with digital practices, and are not so familiar with virtual worlds and so on. So I think it's always nice to contextualize everyone. And the PdBA also has so many a very broad group of people that engages with the activities that we do. Each activity covers a very different group of people, and that's really exciting. I think it's nice that we also kind of try to introduce certain concepts and topics, but also in the sense that people that might be watching that also know quite a lot about the topic, so we also invite them to join the discussion and bring us exciting questions that we might have trouble answering, and so on. So I was going to start with, well, first, what might be your understanding of digital spatiality, since this is, for the PdBA, a very umbrella concept, and we're considering all possible understanding and thoughts around what is digital space and digital spatialities. And how would you kind of connect that with today's topic in terms of performance spaces for virtual worlds?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ine.
So, I mean, it's an interesting question, because digital spaces can be, at least in the way I frame it and the way I perceive it, digital spaces are so many things. It can be something like a virtual world, what we most traditionally think when we think virtual spaces, which is a video game, something like World of Warcraft, or I don't know, like the art world Starling, which is Second Life, which nobody plays but artists. I honestly don't know anyone who's in Second Life, not Second World, Second Life, that's not an artist. But anyway, so that's like the more traditional perception that we have. But the thing is, we have other spaces, and the way I negotiate this is because I use Martina Lowe's definition of a space, which is an arrangement of objects and people that is also indexed. So it means it has meanings that this group of people have assigned to it. And well, yeah, you can say it's a very anthropocentric definition. I do believe that. I mean, space itself is a social construct. It's not like no animal goes and decides, oh, I'm going to make a space. Like an animal just inhabits what we call space, right? But they do it in their own perception of, oh, well, I need food. Is this place have food? Whereas we go on and say, okay, I want to create a community. So it's not necessarily physical. Like even when we think of what I don't really like the term, but meat space, even in real world, spaces can be metaphorical, they can be conceptual. So when you say, oh, this is a safe space for, I mean, the queer community or something like that, you don't really literally mean that, I don't know, meeting room or that thing. It's the collection of people that make it a space. So when we translate that into the virtual world, you can have things like a Discord server is a social space. And it is a space, right? Because it's the arrangement of people and objects and everything. So we can have spaces which are these social media sites, right? But it can also be distribution platforms like Twitch or YouTube, which are less social media and they're more a different kind of thing. But it can even be a data set, for example, code, which we don't really think about it that way. But with the introduction of like AI, one of the things that you have to picture is that the computer is also performing, well, it's always performing, but it's performing the performance itself. So it's looking at you, it's looking at your work, at what you're performing maybe on real space, and it has to assign it meaning and arrangements, and then it does its own thing. And one of the things is that there has to be a degree of interaction, right? Like, and this is also a question because what's interaction, right? Because there's some interpretation, but it's like, oh, looking at an artwork activates it, and that's an interaction. I do not agree with that definition. I think it's too broad. I think there has to be some reaction to the interaction.
And now we're talking more about the concept of performance.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and then extending that to digital performance or digital spaces, how does that kind of change this concept in terms of having a reaction? Like we are having now a streamed talk that has a chat that people can interact through it, but at the same time we can't really not only we have a delay, by the way, so people be aware of that. You might send questions that we have to kind of see with a bit of delay, but also we can't there's a certain limit to how we can perceive and interact with that kind of public audience, or however you want to call it, right?
Well, that's a tricky thing, right? Because performance studies, it's not just art. Like performance studies is life, it's sex, it's politics, it's ritual. There's like several subdivisions of performance, which is like Richard Schechner studies and categorizes performance as. Richard Schechner is one of like the main theoreticians for performance. And so when I'm talking about performance, obviously I'm referring to something that's art, and I kind of stay within that space because otherwise anything I could call anything performance, right? And it is, because you're performing in terms of how you interact with people. How you perform in a church is different than how you perform in another space, right? But specifically in virtual spaces, performance can be complicated because one of the main things of performance art has been the body and the embodiment and the liveness of things. Whereas in virtual worlds, you could argue that there's no liveness. You could argue that there's no contact. The body is not there. So theoreticians like Peggy Fallon doesn't really believe in this. But the thing is, and this is not something that it's just me. It's several like reputations have come to this argument. It's like, well, yeah, there is aliveness, and the thing is, the interaction, the touching doesn't have to be physical. Like you have interactions just between people thinking and reacting to one another. So that's what opens up the discussion for us to think of performance within virtual spaces, because as long as you have a space that you can conceptualize, and you have some form of conceptual body So in the case, for example, of a virtual world, you have an avatar. In the case of a data set, you have something which is the simulations of the body that the computer is keeping track of. In the case of social media, you have your persona, right? Like, I don't know, like Danger Star 5672 or something like that. You know what I mean. Your username, and it is performance because you are performing an identity there. But when we go into art, it obviously has this extra layer of meaning, and I think that's where my research comes into play.
Yeah, and you have been researching this for quite some time, and what would you say then with this very broad conception of all of these performance digital spaces and so on? What would you say is your main interest and what drives you to this topic or this field, however you want to call it?
So it's complicated. In a way, the thing that mostly motivated me to go into performance is this one artist who's called Poppy, and Poppy is she exists in the periphery of the art world. But if you look at her performances on YouTube, they're very Fluxus influenced. Like you can clearly see the influence of Duchamp and Dada and Fluxus movements. And one of the things I noticed is that no one was talking about this, right? Like no one's talking about art that's happening outside of traditional art spaces. And by art spaces, I mean, for example, the virtual gallery, the virtual museum, the actual museum, right? The institution, things like the Palacio de Bellas Artes, all these things. Performance art is also happening in like people actually doing these things, just we don't notice them as academics. So part of the project at Caucus, which is the project I'm attached with Dr. Inge Hinterwagner, is the finding these hidden internet manifestations of anything. Like in my case, it's performance. In her case, it's virtual browsers. Internet browsers. So what we wanted to do is figure out what's out there. And that's my interest there. Like these things are really exciting and we don't notice.
So you're already talking about some of the challenges that come to doing performance in this sort of scenarios. So one of them is like it's was a bit part of not only talking about online based practices in general, digital art in general, also how we document it and how we keep it alive for quite a while for people to also access it and find it and experience something that they have not seen before and so on. And so how do we deal with this? How have you in your research then been dealing with this kind of challenge of finding, spotting, and I mean the research is also part of this preservation and kind of tracking of these practices, right? So
yeah, so it's complicated. Generally, you just like start looking at. So the first thing is you have to figure out what's performance. Like, what are you going to include? Because like, is theatrical performance included within performance art? Is musical performance considered within performance art? And then you find like these. I can't remember the artist, but there's this artist that's talking about his work, and he says that when he's with theater people, they say this is not theater. And when he talks to performance people, they go like, this is theater, this is not performance. So he exists in this no space, literally, which is ironic if you think about it. But one of the things I've noticed is, for example, we tend to be a little bit elitist. So, and this is not talking like saying, oh, this person I'm going to talk about is like inferior or not worth of consideration. But like, for example, Jean-Michel Jarre. I don't know if you're familiar with his work.
No, I heard it through you. Yeah. So
in fact,
feel free if you want to, share your screen whenever you want to let me know.
People actually, I can do it now. So Jean-Michel Jarre is a musician, techno musician. He's like 79 now, and he's always been like really interested in like creating really impactful things. And one of the pieces that he has is a performance in the virtual Notre Dame. And what he did, here it is. So what he did is he created a recreation of the cathedral on VRChat. And then he is in his studio near Notre Dame, the actual physical space. And he streamed this thing, right? Like, so he's performing within Notre Dame, but he's not in Notre Dame, he's in his studio. But the people, the audience are in a virtual Notre Dame. So we already have like several, what I call layers of performance. But the funny thing is, in the art world, people are like, oh yeah, Jean-Michel Jarre, he's like one of the first like real concerts in virtual space. And that's simply not true. One of the first like documented performances in virtual space, if you want to think about it that way, is Suzanne Vega. I don't know if you're familiar with her. This I am waiting, but
is the singer, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Is it Luca? I think is the song. Is this from her? I think.
Tom's Diner.
My name
yeah.
is Luca, something like that.
Oh well, yeah, she has that one, but the very famous Tom's Diner, and she did it on Second Life in it's not in 2024, but she did this thing during an interview with because she was called the mother of the MP3. The first MP3 ever made was of that song, Tom's Diner. So she did a performance within Second Life during an interview. But then that was a very simple thing. It was just spontaneous. She decided to sing while being interviewed. But if you were going to talk about like a truly multimedia interactive performance in a virtual space, then we can go to Fortnite and the Marshmallow concert, which happened 2 years before Jean-Michel Jarre. And not only that, then we have Lil Nas X, and he did like another concert also on Fortnite. That was 47 million people watched it and interacted within it, because that's the other thing. In Fortnite, people were allowed to move around and perform themselves. Like they could dance, they could jump around, they could do things within the space that was created. There were even like interactive installations. Whereas Jean-Michel Jarre, he just sat there and watched the performance. So I think that sometimes we look at these things and like, oh no, this is popular, this is pop, and we don't fully consider it because why would I, right? Like there's always this feeling. So
there's also this association that these games like Fortnite is just more commercial, and also like they are pulling bands like, you know, Metallica, and then having having them this kind of stage. And I know this because there was a meme that I saw online. A kid found out for the first time what Metallica was. In fact, I think, I don't know, maybe he was Mexican or something, because he couldn't pronounce even Metallica. That was the whole kind of was like Metallica, you know, like they had the accent, like, and then in the end, this brought the idea that there's a very young generation getting to know different bands, but also different, you know, could be different artists performing there. That's not only bands and so on, because there's also a different kind of public and people that are engaging with that specific space and context, right? And that makes it quite interesting, I think, because then we're not only putting it only in spaces that are already being sanctioned as art, but also spaces that have already a very specific public, right, which is the museum space, that not necessarily are going to be there a younger generation, if not through the school visits or and things like that, and vice versa, because there are also museums that concentrate more in school visits and less on an adult public that might be also interested in engaging with different kind of artworks and so on.
Yeah, definitely. And that's one of the biggest challenges museums face all the time. It's attracting younger audiences. And one of the problems we have is that we still have this 18th century idea or 19th century idea of art, where it's like, you are quiet, you are reverential, right? And things have to be serious. Where, and it's ironic because at the same time we're talking about things like Fluxus. Fluxus was like all about playing. Like it had a political background, but it was still playful. It was still silly, right? If you look at all these poets in the 1920s with like Kurt Schwitters and his Ursonante, which is just like bim, boom, zam, boom. Like there's playfulness there that I think we had forgotten in a way. And ignoring these spaces has made it that art seems to be something for the elites. And that's also why we have lost so much support in the arts, because the normal common people don't see it as valuable, because it's a thing for rich people, right? Yes, I'm back. Okay, so things like, for example, DC Spensley, which is also doing like musical performance, and Martina Menegon, who's doing these things of like deleting all her Second Life assets, are ignored because they're like, oh, it's in the game, right? Whereas young people, this is how they engage with art the first time. Like, not everybody goes, and especially when you're talking about like the global South, we don't have the same access to culture. Like, for example, in Mexico, like we have our art, like we have our things like Aztec art, we have Mesoamerican art, all these things, but we don't have as much access to, for example, Picasso. We don't have as much access to Degas, or even like artists from other continents. Like, it's our stuff and then a few things that we have from like colonization or things like that, but it's not the same thing. And so how a lot of us engage with art is first through popular culture. So things like Penderclaws, for example, this is an art collective that does video games. They're creating these things, for example, The Tempest. And this is like Shakespeare's Tempest, but they do it in a playful way. They invite a professional actor, and then they invite players, and they teach them how to reenact the play. So there's like this person narrating what's happening, and then there's like, and now I need someone to do lightning bolts, and then and now I need you to go and do this. And that's the way how you engage. And it is art. This is what we're now calling community connected art. But we're ignoring some of it because it doesn't come from an artist who said, okay, I'm going to do this, right? So one of the things I think is that we need to be more open.
And we add to that, I think, this feeling, the general feeling from the art institutions that they don't know exactly how to engage now with, and blaming, this new generation and how do we engage with it, but also they're really sometimes stuck in these old ways, not so old ways, but not exploring enough perhaps these more unconventional understanding of spatiality. And this is also why the PdBA is eager to investigate this further, because I think there is still this kind of worry from museums, but also from independent galleries and projects, like, how do we engage with the public? Which are these spaces? Even for social media, how do we kind of promote or engage or call upon not only a diverse public, but the one we were before kind of engaging with, that we don't know how to connect anymore, because the platforms have changed, and they changed so fast. Before was, Facebook, we had Facebook events, and that was really easy. And we had artists doing also, when that was like the big thing, especially when I was investigating online-based platforms for exhibition making. There were a lot of artists doing performance on Facebook as well. That I think you might have some examples there as well. And so that was the space. Now it changed. So people, not only as not only consumers of social media and so on, and producers, don't know exactly anymore where to go to, like which social media we have to be, but where is the venue? Like, to whom and to where are we going to actually perform? So this is, you add to that, to those layers, this complexity that people really don't know which are these spaces. And I think, I don't know, do you have any other examples? There's games, of course. This is why we would say games and beyond, social media platforms and online pages, like independent artist browsers. They try to do something connected to the browser as well. What else? Where else can we see things nowadays?
So that's a really good question. For example, in this case, Joseph Delap, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He did this thing in a video game called America's Army. It was called Killed in Iraq, or Dead in Iraq in 2006. And he would just sit in the middle of a match. America's Army is a propaganda tool by the US Army that they did, which is basically a first-person shooter where you would like fight. It had a very interesting mechanic where you would always see the enemies as, and this is really how you see that it's propaganda, as Arabic. But the other teams, and you saw yourself as the soldiers, like the American soldiers. But when the other team would see themselves as the soldiers, and they would see you as Arabic, because it was in the middle of the second Iraq War. So what Joseph did is he would sit in the spawning area, and he would just put on his microphone and start reading the names of people who had died in the war, right? Like a list of soldiers who had fallen in combat. And the reactions the people had were very visceral. But then he also used Twitch. And that's like the second layer of the performance, because he was on Twitch while he was doing the readings. And then he would answer to people on Twitch as he was performing. So it became a secondary performance on top of the original performance. And that's another side where you can find a lot of this. YouTube is a platform where, like, for example, we have I'm going to make the same mistake as before. Okay, here we go. The Poppy thing. Poppy also did something on YouTube, which is help Poppy build a computer, for example, where you used emojis. Like, I'm going to use one here. Oh, I can't see it. So you see the Poppy in these computer parts, and people would vote on what part Poppy was supposed to take and put into the computer. So it's like, click on the smiley face if you want her to use this piece. Click on the heart if you want her to pick this piece. And there was like crowdsourced, and then she would do the thing, and something would happen on the screen. So that's that was using YouTube. Yeah, like that, exactly. So she was using the tools of Facebook to create a more involving thing, for example. In another one of her performances, she was using telephones. In this one, call Poppy at 805-624-6667. What she did was she sat in front of the couch, and there was this number, and people could call her, and she would pick up the phone live, but she would do it acting as a pre-recorded message. So she would be like, "Hi, I'm Poppy, how are you?" And then she would stay quiet. People would answer, and she would still stay quiet. So as if giving, you know how those automated messaging systems are. So she would get like time, and then she would say, "Oh, that's really interesting. Nice to meet you. What is your favorite something?" And she would stay quiet, and then the person would answer like a very short answer, and then she would stay still quiet. So people were starting to doubt the reality, but you had also the feed from Twitch, and those messages and comments would appear on the screen. So there was people in the background like sending all these things, and then you could hear people in the background giving her instructions. It was a very complex performance that was happening at the same time. So using so many technologies, telephone, using the YouTube feed, using the chat function of Twitch, all these things to generate this multimedia thing. Another example that I really like is Charlotte Tribus. She is a German performance artist. Let me find the example here.
While you find it, just
yes.
going back to that first question again, like you're showing these examples, and some of them already don't even exist anymore, meaning that we can't access them anymore. And is there any other platform that have been kind of collecting those and trying to create an archive? Are there any archives dedicated to the specific type of performances on virtual
There
worlds?
is. So we have this thing. Where is it? It's all the way at the bottom. Here it is. So there's this thing called Radiance VR. This is an initiative by an artist in the universities in Germany. And what they're doing is they're creating this collection of VR performances. And you can rent out these experiences. So you pay them about 3 to 10 euros, I believe. And that gives you permission to put on like your VR headset, and you can see the performances happen. And they're collecting all these performances from various very well-known artists. So we do have these attempts at collecting. But one of the problems they have is, for example, in the case of Radiance VR, you have to sideload the app. And not everybody knows how to do that. Yeah. Sideloading is when you don't use like the Apple Store. You're using like an independent, it's not hacking, but it's close to it. So you're getting around the limitations of Meta and its own like prohibitions of what is acceptable. There's also this thing which I was like talking about, like with Charlotte. It's the use of personally produced apps. Mm-hmm. So in the case of Charlotte, for example, she does work with app stores, with Apple Store particularly, and she creates these virtual, like augmented reality performances where she danced. Her motions are captured. They're put into the app, and the app has a soundtrack, and just like moving, but the app reacts to your space. So the avatars try to be placed not on tables or clipping through the table, but actually using the space you're in. But if you move too close to, because it's free roam, so you can move around it. If you get too close to the avatar will move back, interrupting the performance and then catching back up. So there's that interactivity we were talking about at the beginning that makes it more than just a video, for example, right? So there's that. There's all these things, and there's performances with with AI, like what also this, Charlotte is doing. She actually has a performance today at CETKM, which uses AI to analyze what's happening. So one of the AIs is describing what it sees. So there's a like 2-3 people, and they seem to be doing a choreography. This seems to be performance art. Then there's another one that's using these algorithms. They're trained to monitor people in, for example, in the UK, that analyzes and says, this person is Arabic, this person is Black, this person is white, this person is wearing a black jacket. And she's using it to analyze her own performance in real time. And it's telling her like, there's blue light, there's green light. And one of the interesting things is that it's obsessed with the color pink. And we couldn't figure out why. Turns out that the camera can see the combinations of the can lights that they're using to create the colors of the actual thing. So you look at it as yellow or blue, sorry, but the computer is actually seeing the different colors that are composing that thing. So it visualizes parts of the performance that you're not always knowing, right? And it's also guessing. It's like, this is flooring, this is fun, this is, and it gives you like percentages of certainty. So it kind of visualizes the activity of the AI in how it monitors you in a way that's not as intrusive as if you actually saw what AI, particularly in the UK, sees when it's monitoring what you're doing in public. So there's all these crazy spaces that I want to cover.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I'm also thinking that, I guess, maybe before, especially in the 60s and 70s, maybe even art institutions were maybe afraid, let's call it, of having experimental, artists and performance artists on show, because they could never kind of anticipate what might happen, especially coming from the artist. And I think maybe nowadays we're also considering that. Isn't that this factor that might be some art institution might be apprehensive in hosting, especially because we're not only thinking about what the artist is going to bring into that, but now online and with, for example, AI or any other more of course some of these can be very predictable, but less predictable outcomes of these interactions. Do you think that this kind of pushes them away in terms of investing in these more experimental spaces?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I don't know if you remember that thing we did at Museums Without Borders, but one of my talk was about what I called corporate prudishness and how it affected artists. And it's about how we're only allowed to be in online, in virtual spaces, we're only allowed to be as rebellious or pushing the envelope as the corporations are comfortable with letting us be, right? And we can see that now with Twitter. I'm never calling it the other name. And what Elon Musk is doing, where anything that doesn't align with his narrative gets censored, right? So how can you create a subculture or an artistic movement with meaning if a corporation can at any time close you down? And that also happens within museums. So you have things like, there was this artist, Harwood, who did an intervention on the Tate Modern website. and he had the authorization from the curators to modify the web page and show you like the history of Tate. Tate Lively is a company that's like a sugar trading company. It has a very dark history of slavery, exploitation, and things like that. And he would visualize that. And the curator and the directors were okay, but marketing was not. And so they forbade the website from being shown. Because in their argument, which is yes and no, their argument was, what if someone just wants to know the opening times? Which we know is a fallacy, because you can go into Google and just go type Tate and you have the opening times. Like that's not really a thing. So he was not allowed to do this thing.
It's kind of undoing their work, and then there's no way of
Exactly.
and that causes money, because that causes the institution money, because they need people coming in. But I'm also thinking that even for artists, that's a big restriction as well. When you want to perform somewhere, that you can't have any type of nudity, or sometimes it's not even nudity, but it resembles a nipple, and then that's already kind of banned. But now you also have all these, if you think about these chats and interaction, like we were talking about earlier, how you have these performance online that needs some kind of interaction as well, but you have filters on the chats, and so that already kind of controls a lot of the possibilities for not only for the creative, but also for the museums also interested in engaging with this. And this was going to be my other question. For artists that are not necessarily from performance or digital art, and for art institution as well, that maybe want to explore this further, these virtual worlds or digital specialities, as we are kind of like an umbrella concept for all of this. Where should they go? Like how can they start their kind of explorations through this different world?
Well, there's several things. Like, for example, I know this artist, Mexican artist, Lisa Cedillo, and she was working with sex work, specifically with the pandemic. And there was this phenomenon in Mexico with people, like students, talking jokingly about selling foot pics to finance themselves through the pandemic. And so Luisa, what she decided to do was go on Facebook, and using what we like, I call it like double speak, but it's like what we see if you're at all familiar with TikTok. TikTok is very restricted, so you can't even say die, because you get immediately banned. So what do they say on a live, right? Or they use different names for different things. So one of the ways that she's gotten around these things is by using that double speak in these spaces, right? Like things are like metaphors or euphemisms for things, and that way they can exist online. The other one is exploiting the thing itself and showing the hypocrisy, and even the banning is actually becomes part of a performative action. So when you were talking about nipples, I believe it was also Luisa who did this one. Basically, she took pictures of topless men and women, but then she would cut out the nipples on Photoshop and switch them. And that confused the AIs enough, because it would recognize male nipples on female breasts, but that would cause like a short circuit. And that's okay. Exactly. And they would see men, but because it didn't see the complete shape of a bust, it would also be okay. So that was a way of gaming these systems. And I think that in itself becomes a protest. The other thing is we now have the Fediverse. I don't know if you're familiar with that, the federated internet, basically.
Yeah.
So things like Mastodon, right? Which is like an alternative to Twitter. Those spaces are freer because you can create your own instance and it connects to the whole network, but it's yours. Like nobody can censor you. Well, they can stop their members from joining you or seeing your content, but you're still there. And not everybody has the same puritanical views that a corporation has. So you can exist in those spaces, and now it connects with Blue Sky, which is it's from the same guy that did Twitter. Yeah. So those spaces will still exist, and the other option is just do it and see what happens. And finally, and this is a funny one because it has been done, it has been used, especially by I think it was the Museo site. They used Pornhub. because they couldn't post their pictures of naked like artworks on YouTube and on Facebook. What they did is they uploaded all their nudes onto Pornhub because Pornhub obviously
Yeah,
wasn't going to
yeah,
do. And Pornhub was ecstatic about it
of
because they
course.
had a bit of a controversy during that period. But at the same time, that was also manipulated. But anyhow, the point is, I've seen artists use these adult platforms, things
Yeah.
like OnlyFans, things like Chatterbait.
Mm-hmm.
I also had a student who did a performance. It was called Plant Bondage, and it was on Chatterbait, and it was literally a bondage performance, but done on a plant. She was completely clothed, and she would whip the plant or put handcuffs on the plant and things like that. And people who were expecting sex at the beginning would be like, "Take your top off," and she would ignore those comments. But eventually, people kind of caught on, and they were like, "Whip the plant,
Oh.
tie it down." So it became a really interesting thing because it's not an audience that traditionally engages with art, but it became a space for art. So you can create your own space. Again, you can create your own spaces. And another example is in VRChat, for example, you can create your own personal spaces, which are isolated. So you can lock them out with passwords, and those don't go through the same moderation that public spaces do. So
Have a private
obviously
performance
that
of.
can get shady, but you can create like a semi-private performance because you can just
Yeah.
give away code like invitations to everyone to be like, do a post on YouTube and say on Instagram and say, hey, we have this thing, just use this password to enter the space.
Mm-hmm.
And then it becomes, you can do your performance within this space without having to go through all the hoops that the other platforms do. And then you can also hook it up to, again, it sounds really skeevy, and in a way it is, but you can connect them to these because it's the only spaces that we have. This is the irony of this. Like we're having to use to invade adult performance spaces, like because it is a performance, like pornography is a performance. But we're having to go into these spaces because the only spaces are not controlled. We know what happened to Tumblr, for example, once any mention of sex, which was done to control the LGBTQ
Mm.
community. One of the things that they did is like, if you talked about being gay or bisexual or anything, it was immediately sexual, which is offensive as hell, and they would ban it. So that killed the platform. Like Tumblr really took a hit. Now it's kind of bouncing back, but they still have these weird rules. So people are still using it. But yeah, so we have to find ways around this censorship in spaces.
And
Or you create your own spaces.
we have also one first comment
Oh,
on Face J's.
cool.
It's really about that, like a cool idea, maybe use virtual worlds to circumvent the censorship. So a bit of what you were talking about here now as well.
Yeah.
Try to make use as well of these existing spaces for other purposes,
Hmm.
and try to find different publics as well. But again, like if you're thinking about museums, and of course that one for the Pornhub, I think there
Yeah.
must have been a marketing strategy behind it.
Yeah, definitely.
But it's always tricky for them because they're always a bit concerned, especially if they have funders, that there's a
Hmm.
government associated to these funding, and they're like, okay, no, we can't
Of
do this
course.
kind of thing. And there's always something like that. Um, do you want to go ahead and show any more examples before we have like last questions? If anyone's in the chat also
So,
want to send some questions to René, um, I think we can answer them in a
so
bit.
I'll share one real quick. Just let me find it. So there's this thing was done by Reporters Without Borders. And again, it was a way to get around censorship, but in this case, government censorship, because they discovered that one of the least things we can do is censor Minecraft. Because if you censor Minecraft, like you would have a revolution immediately. Like children would be furious. So what they did is they created this uncensored library on Minecraft, right? And what you do is you go into the space, which is a very traditional museum space. I don't know why it's not loading. Well, you can see it here, and it's very like neoclassical. and you go and it has news that have been censored in their home country. So, for example, in my case for Mexico, things about the cartels that were happening during the last presidency. Well, the presidency is still happening with Andrés López Obrador. The rise in violence against women and all these things that were being censored in Mexican media are held in this place. The same thing happened with articles by Khashoggi in Saudi Arabia, I believe it was. So all these things are kept in this digital library. You can download it. So you can get it from a friend. They can email you the server, and you can run your own instance of it, right? Because that's the beauty of Minecraft. It doesn't have a centralized thing. So this is a way that you can get around all these things. And I think it helps museums be a little bit freer. That was like a little bit in response to what the person was saying. And your very like valid objection of using like adult sites. So there are ways. Obviously, you're going to lose a little bit of fidelity if you're using Minecraft, but limitation breeds innovation, I believe.
And we also talked about the fact that there's also a need, especially from curators, for people that are developing these sort of spaces for art institutions independently, or larger initiatives and spaces, that they need to play games. They need to use the technology, and going back to like how can they start. I think there's so many tools that they could kind of explore. One, well, go to Steam and try to find something there that might be more attractive to each of it. Everyone has a different taste in terms of games, because I think there's also this idea that they're well-known games that are maybe first-person shooter. I think we lost René again. Okay, we're back. Yeah.
Again,
there's these kind of games that are more well-known in the media, that shooter games, or things that have well, media says about games are violent and so on.
Yeah,
That
exactly.
people think that there's only one group of games that are more community based, that involve a lot of people engaging in it, and so on. But there's so many different types. But in the same way, different ways of using different purposes for using VR and AR and etc. And how would you be able to kind of explore that further if you don't engage with those technologies and experiment themselves, right?
Yeah, so like for example, this thing, like the VR Museum of Fine Art. The one thing I don't like about this is that they constrain themselves to the language of museums. So at least this one lets you get like like what they said, like uncomfortably close. But sometimes, like, why do they have barriers? Why do they have walls? Why do they use these things? And that's one of the things that I do in my own work in the gallery space, like the New Media Caucus. We have this exhibition right now called My Internet, and it's a reflection of everything that's influenced me. And it's completely floating. Everything is floating. There's no floor. You can move around. Things are upside down, on an angle, because in that way, I force you to engage with it. And I think museums can find these platforms. For example, New Art City. It's also one of the that we use a lot. Oh, it's opening mine. Okay, never mind. That's fine. So, for example, New York City, it's very easy. You just load your work, give it an appearance. You control like how it moves and stuff. And if I click preview, I hope that it works. Share this tab instead. So, for example, you can see like, nothing is. So that's Casimir Malevich, but it's presented in a way that's never seen in a real space, right? Like cube floating. So we have all these ways of engaging and creating virtual spaces that are still friendly. They still exist in independence of the big corporations, and I think they might be friendlier for institutions. At the same time, I create my research and my interest is more in smaller communities who don't have to be bound by these things. Like they can create in Pornhub, they can create on TikTok, they can create on Minecraft, and all of these spaces that can be friendly for them. The museums themselves, they can figure out like the same thing, but they have to find things that are more aligned with political and marketing concerns that I'm not completely comfortable with, in a way. But I understand the need for these things. And yeah, like you said, it's necessary for them to modernize, to keep moving, because one of the things is like everything takes forever to be implemented. Like museums still use Facebook. Facebook is used by like 60-year-olds now. Everybody else left. And now it's Instagram and TikTok. And God knows what's going to be in a few years, right? Because especially because they're thinking of banning TikTok in the US. And that's going to hit a lot of things. So I don't know. We have to find ways around everything, and the best way is using these platforms mostly to make people aware of what there is, but then using our own like ingenuity to generate these transgressive spaces, I like to call them.
And since you mentioned your exhibition now, I was going to say that perhaps it's worth mentioning also the books that you wrote about this, the Game Arts Curators Kit. That's also a very nice go-to for those who want to venture in terms of exhibiting this type of work. And the video game art reader, the 2024 edition. Maybe you can talk more about those since, it's recent.
Yeah. So, for example, the Game Arts Curator Kit, this was an initiative that we did with a group called Gaia, or Games Art International Network. Sorry. And the idea was to get people involved from all kinds of areas of game design and create a manual that could help curators who were not familiar with video games on how to engage with them. Because one of the things that you notice is this resistance to playing games. Oh, I don't know how to play games, so I don't play games. But then why are you talking about games, right? So that was this manual. That was the intention behind it. It was done co-edited. I co-edited with Chas Evans from VGA Gallery in Chicago, Tiffany Funk, Jim Monroe, Lujan Olton. I believe she's in Germany now as well. So all these academics are like really involved in games internationally. So it was a really interesting project. I really enjoyed working with it. There's a print version that you can get, or you can go to the website. The website is free to. Obviously, we would love for you to buy it because it boosts our numbers, right? It's not that expensive. It's like $20. Yeah. Exactly. It's the only way that we can keep doing these things. And we don't really, well, we were paid, but we don't really see more money beyond that. But it's a way of proving to editorials, to book publishers that this is worthy of doing. And then there's also the INMA, sorry.
We lost, we're just coming back in the meantime. If anyone else has any last question, I think we're going to say goodbye in a bit while we wait for René to rejoin us. But I'd like to say, thank you very much for those who are watching us live and those who are watching us afterwards through YouTube as well.
I am back.
I was just thanking everyone that was already sending there's a new comment saying Minecraft Censored Library is the new Alexandria library. And I was thanking everyone that was participating in the chat, and for those who have any other questions afterwards as well, just reach out, because there's so much to talk about and there's not enough time.
Yeah. So just real quick, this is the other one. It's in my manual. In my manual. If you go like INMA manual, you will find it. It's a manual for curating all kinds of new media art, VR, AR, video, audio, all these things. It's a collection of research from about 5 years of practice that I've had at the time. I should update it, but I am trying to find like support for that because it's intensive work. So those are the main publications that I had. I had like other smaller works, but I think these two are the ones that I'm most proud of.
Definitely great references. Thank you. And thank you very much for your contributions for today. I think I can't believe has passed like an hour of chat. And well, I hope we can continue the conversation. The project of the PdBA is also about this. So we chose this topic of digital spatialities, like I said, as more of an investigation tool that we can use and actually learn and try to map and see what are these digital spaces for not only for performance, but for many other different digital art fields and so on. And so we plan as well throughout early 2025 to have some kind of maybe a result, an outcome, or a final consideration of what they are. And thank you for contributing to the discussion, and definitely will add a lot to that, to our understanding. Do you want to say any last comments, René?
I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to my crazy ramblings. And you can find me at renegecepeda.art, which is my homepage. I need to update it, I just noticed. But I can also be found on Instagram and on Facebook with the same René G. Cepeda. But honestly, if you have any thoughts you want to share and any questions you have, I'd be happy to respond. And if there's something on the chats on Twitch or on the archived version of it, I will happily reply. Thank you.
Super. All right, everyone. Thank you very much, and thank you, René, again, and DigiArtists for supporting us and to follow us for more. And again, the same thing, like, subscribe, and all that thing, because it does help us buy the book, help us kind of continue these super interesting topics and discussions online and available for everyone. So thank you very much, and